We've always felt very welcome here at Genesis. I can remember when our kids were small, there was always a certain excitement because, we were coming, and in those days, the girls used to talk about coming to the donut church or the cookie church. And there was always plates and plates and plates of cookies downstairs, and the kids couldn't wait to come and to partake of some of those cookies. And then when Kathy and I had the privilege of being able to be here for a year, about 7 years ago, it really was a privilege for us just to cement some of those relationships with you guys, and just to really get to know you better and to enjoy being with you and being part of the body of Christ here. And we really felt like we had a home here in the States. Kathy hadn't lived in the States for any real sort of length of time for a long, long time. I hadn't either. And I think at the end of our year, we really felt like we had a spiritual home in the States. Even if we've got relationships with other churches, this was definitely our home. So Kathy and I, is this up? Do you want to jump it on one? I don't know what's happening. There you go. Kathy and I, we live in France. We've been in France for nearly 28 years now. Kathy and I actually met in France. We were both involved in a short-term mission back in the early 80s. Kathy went with a mission called Operation Mobilization. Some of you might have heard of it. But in any case, Kathy went with them. She went originally for 2 months and ended up staying 3 years. I went originally for 1 year and ended up staying 2. And my first year, Kathy's second year, we were working on the same team together. And that's how we got to know one another. And then the rest of it is history, as they say. But in any case, Kathy and I, we lived in France for a while. And then we went back to England, and I worked on a farm, on my family farm. And then it was during the 7 years that we were living in England at the time that we felt that God was calling us to go back to France. If you'd asked me when I was with OM, if ever I would be a missionary or a pastor in France, I would have said never. I couldn't imagine why on earth or what on earth I would be doing, and I couldn't imagine that I would be suitable for doing something like that. I can remember when I was at school, I think I got the worst mark in the class in French. And I was so bad, I was allowed to give up French in school when I was 13. Most kids went on at least to 16 or 17. I was allowed to drop it and do metal work because that seemed much more applicable to me and to my future. I thought I was going to be milking cows and working on the farm. But in any case, I think God has a good sense of humor. And for some reason, he chose me and Kathy and I and our family to go to France. And we've been involved in church planting work in that country for a number of years now. And France has been in the news recently. You might have... I'm going the wrong way. That's why it's not working. France has been in the news recently. You perhaps saw the photos and the video feed of the cathedral in Paris, Notre Dame, burning. I can remember I came home from a meeting that evening. I put the computer on just to see the headlines before going to bed, and I saw one of the headlines saying, Notre Dame is burning, and I just thought it was somebody having a joke. I couldn't imagine that cathedral was burning. But in any case, they have a project now of rebuilding it in the next 5 years. We'll see whether the president is accurate in his hopes for that. But France is much more than a country with beautiful old cathedrals. Notre Dame was 850 years old, and there's other cathedrals and other churches and other places that you can visit that date back to a similar time. And you can see vestiges of how the people in France used to live years and years and years ago. But France is much more than just a place of culture. There's the Louvre Museum in Paris, and there's other museums that you can visit, and there's things like that. In France, you do have a good lifestyle in France. I think Kathy and I, we're not really missing anything in terms of our basic needs and what we would like. And yet France is a country with huge spiritual needs. They say that something like 65% of the population would claim to be Catholic. But in terms of making any kind of regular practice of their faith, it would be much less than that. About 20% of the population is a figure that's creeping up. Between 20 and 25% would claim to be atheists. Around about 10% of the population would call themselves Muslims, and that in large part would be people who would be descendants of people who've immigrated into the country from North Africa. So you see any number of Muslims around the country. The Protestant church, at one point back in the 17th century, counted perhaps for nearly half of the population of France. Today, only 2% of the population would recognize themselves as being Protestant. And then the evangelical church in France is part of the Protestant church, but it's really even smaller yet. There's about 1% of the population of France would recognize themselves as being members of a Protestant church, an evangelical church, a church like yourselves here. There's about 2,500 churches, evangelical churches across France, serving a population of something like 65 million. That works out at about one church for every 27,000 people, which really is pittance. It's really, really small. Just to help you perhaps to understand, churches, I think in the States, and I'll show you a slide in a minute, about how many churches there are here in Newcastle alone. And when you compare it to what we are living at home, it's next to nothing. The church where Kathy and I are is in a town called Château-Arnoux-Saint-Auban. It's a bit of a mouthful. In fact, it was two towns that came together. And anybody in our area talks about Château or Château-Arnoux. We don't use the whole name because it takes too long to say. But it's down in the southeast of France in an area called Provence. It's an area that is known for its lavender fields. And at the right time of the year, at the end of June or the beginning of July, I could take you out to the areas where there's lavender growing. And you just see these fields going on and on and on, almost it seems like forever. And you wonder how many acres of lavender there must be. It must be a colossal number. It's a rural area. It's mostly small towns, small villages. The largest town in our area would be about the size of Newcastle. People, for the most part, tend to be fairly suspicious of newcomers coming in. It takes a long time to make friends and to get to know people. Kathy and I have been living in the house that we're in now nearly 6 years, and we're just finally starting to feel as if we have taken a step in really getting to know some of our neighbors. And it's sometimes it seems incredible and at times frustrating to see how long it's taking to get to know people. I can illustrate the fact perhaps best by sharing a little incident that happened to me when Kathy and I first went down to the area. We used to be in the Paris area, and there was the church was interested in the south there, was interested in having us come, and so we went down for a long weekend to visit the area and to meet the church. And when we were down there, the couple that were taking care of us, they took us out for a walk on the Saturday afternoon, and we'd walked out into the country. It was a beautiful area, and we walked back to the village. And as we were leaving the village, the light was almost perfect, and I just asked the husband if he would mind just pulling over for a moment so I could take a photo of the village. And as I was taking a photo, there was an old guy who was walking out of the village, and he came by and he said, "So what are you doing?" And I said, "Well, where I live, at home we don't have any villages anywhere near as pretty as this, and I just wanted to take a photo of it. And I said, if my wife and I were to move into the area, would we be made to feel welcome? And he looked at me and he said, you have two problems. He said, one, you're English, and two, you're Parisian. We'd been living in Paris for about 20 years at that time. And he said, my family moved up from Marseille 5 generations ago. And he said, they still refer to me as being the person who comes from Marseille. And so he couldn't get rid of it. After 5 generations, he couldn't get rid of that name tag. And so people tend to be rather suspicious, rather slow to open up and to build good relationships with people. The town or the area around us is bigger than a county, but it's not as big as a state. But we talk about departments, and France has 95 different departments around France. And our department is this area up here. And there's about 162,000 inhabitants in that area, of which, and there's only 8 churches, 8 evangelical churches serving that population. I went through the number of churches and just tried to imagine one day. So I sat down and thought, well, how many people will be attending church on a Sunday morning? And came up with a figure of about 500 people in our department out of that 162,000 inhabitants. Some of the churches are very small. There's 3 or 4 of our churches in our area. Probably only 10, 15, 20 people at most would be attending on a Sunday morning. So that means that less than 0.5%, about 0.3% of the population of our area would have any real contact with a church and have any real understanding of what the gospel really is. And so I'd ask that you'd really pray for us as a church as we try to reach out and to break down some of those barriers. We had a guy just recently who has become a Christian, and he was giving his testimony in one of our outreach Bible breakfasts. And he said that he had always been told to be very careful not to have contact with our church because it was a sect. And that, I think, would be how a lot of people would view us, as being, sort of a rather strange group, and not very, being very suspicious of who we are. If you compare the number of people, like I was saying, 162,000 in our area, 8 churches. I went online yesterday afternoon, and apparently there's about 87,000 people live in Lawrence County. And in Newcastle, there's just over 22,000 people who live, apparently. And I did a search to see how many churches there were in Newcastle. I don't know whether this is really strictly true or not, but I came up with a figure of over 50 different churches just in the town of Newcastle. And so you can sort of understand a little bit the difference that what it means to be a Christian at home, be part of a church, how that can affect the way that you try to share the gospel and witness. And a lot of it is built on relationships. I know it is here as well. It's important to be sharing the gospel with those people that we know and with whom we have a relationship. But it's important to really be building good relationships with people. The church is in a town of just over 5,000 inhabitants. If you include the little towns and villages around us, we have people coming from a community of around about 21,000 people. And that's our primary field of mission. And we would really like to see more people coming from that area. The church started back in the early 2000s, in 2002. A group of 6 families were meeting together. And they were meeting together for prayer and for Bible study midweek. They were attending other churches, but some of the churches were perhaps almost an hour away, and they just felt it was too far to go midweek. And so they started meeting in one another's homes just to encourage one another and pray for one another. And as time went on, the group started to grow, and they got to the point where they said, well, why don't we meet on a Sunday morning? And so that's what they did. They started meeting on a Sunday morning to worship God together. And in 2012, just before we moved down to that area, they were able to buy that building, which is the part on the right-hand side of the photo. It was an old butcher's shop. And so they went through a time of transition, knocking down walls, changing things. And it took about 9 or 10 months. And then finally we were able to start using the building. Today, there's approximately 90 people who would be connected to the church. That we would, generally speaking, be about 65 on a Sunday morning. But if you included everybody who comes from time to time, I guess we'd be up around about 90. That photo was taken at a church weekend. We have a church weekend once a year, and we go up into the mountains to a retreat area, and this was taken last year. Church life would be very similar to church life here, I guess, in many ways. Sunday service, Sunday school, youth activities. This is a photo of our small youth group. It was taken last June. We went up into the mountains and went camping for the weekend. And I can tell you, it was freezing cold. We had temperatures were down near to freezing. I think we were all expecting it to be warmer. And I put a mattress and I had a sleeping bag in the back of my car, and I slept in that, and it was absolutely bitterly cold. But in any case, the kids seemed to survive it, and they enjoyed it, and some good memories of it, and at least we can laugh about it now. So that's the main thing. But, please pray for our kids and for the youth that come along. We really want to see them come to know Christ and to trust in Christ. And it's been neat to see some of them. As this year we've been looking at the question of what is a Christian, and there's one or two of them who are starting to think about baptism, and it's been really neat to see some of them taking steps with Christ. There was a girl who is in high school who, I don't know if you know of How to Life. It's a young people's group that are it's young people trying to reach out to young people. And she got enthusiastic about this, and she organized an event at the end of March. And there were about 150 young people that came to a church down in Marseille to that event. And it's neat to see how some of these young people are taking steps to grow in their relationship with God and seeking to get to share the gospel with people around them. It's often in ways which surprises me. When she started to tell me about her project, I said, in my mind I was thinking she needs at least a year to plan and prepare this. She did the whole thing in about 2.5 months. It was amazing to see, but it was great to see her enthusiasm and just how committed she was to the project. We run outreach events. For the last 3 years, we've been having an outreach breakfast. Each month, we offer croissant, coffee, fruit juice to people who want to come, and there's always a theme. And some of the themes that we've looked at in the past have been things like, what is faith? Why choose God? What is Easter? Who is Jesus? Questions like that, questions that, what is the goal of your life? To try to get people to think about some of these questions. And what we do is we meet around, we have tables set up, and then people will come. They'll sit at the tables and discuss the question around the tables, and there's usually somebody who's leading the discussion from the front, asking different questions and just jogging us along a little bit. And it's led into times of real sharing. The guy who on that morning, this was taken in April, he became a Christian about 6 months ago. And last year, he started coming to some of these outreach breakfasts. He has a friend who lives close to him who has started witnessing. And, it's been really neat to see the way that this guy has grown in his desire to know God and to love God and to serve God. And the theme when he was speaking was, can God really change a life? And his life has really been changed. It's been transformed from what it was to what it is today. He grew up, he never knew his father, he only knew stepfathers, and he said the best stepfather he ever had was simply an alcoholic. The others were worse than that. And, it's really neat to see how God has been changing his life. And he said in his testimony, he said one of the things that really struck him was the welcome. He'd been invited, or he and his family had been invited to a church barbecue. And they came along, but they were sort of very cautious, really questioned whether they would stay or not. And when he was leaving, he said, he and his wife, they said to one another, I don't think we've ever been better received, better welcomed than we were this evening. Even our family doesn't welcome us as well as that. And so it really spoke to both of their hearts. And it's been neat to see the way that God has been working in their lives and bringing them to himself and starting to change and transform them. Just before Easter, we showed the film Case for Christ. It's the story of the conversion of Lee Strobel. And that was a really interesting evening. We had about 55 people who came. I would think 15 to 20 non-Christians who were there. And it was just looking at the proof or the, why do we as Christians say that Jesus rose again? What are the bases upon which we proclaim that truth? And, we didn't see any conversions that evening, but we saw a number of people come for the first time to the church. So just ask that you would continue to pray for that. Kathy's going to come up. She's going to talk about the Christmas markets, because that's really where Kathy gives a lot of her time during the year. Christmas in our church always starts very early. Usually it starts in February. And Kathy will start to tell you why it starts so early. Yeah.
It's wonderful to be with you today, to see so many faces, so many of you that we know and love. There's a few faces that are missing, and that's obviously difficult. But as I look around, there's a lot of faces, a lot of you I don't recognize, and I think what a blessing to see an evolving church. And it's lovely to be here. I think it was probably about 5 years ago when we started talking in the church about the idea of a Christmas market. And as we brainstormed and wondered where this project was going to go, we basically saw 3 goals. And there was a young woman in the church that said, we pray together, we praise the Lord together, we eat together. Maybe it's time that we start working together. And so one of the goals of the Christmas market is to be together and to work together, to make things together that we know are going to be sold at the Christmas market. The second goal is to make the church known more in the community, so that people would come to church and be with us, maybe step into the church that would never do that before. And so that's the second goal, that contact with the community. The third goal of the Christmas market is that any funds that are any profit is divided between 2 different missions. And the first one is a safe home for mothers and children in Romania. And the second is a work in refugees in Beirut, Lebanon. And I'm always amazed when I think that in the country of Lebanon, 1/3 of the population are immigrants. And I think, what a burden for that country. And it's a blessing to be involved even in such a small way that we are. So those are the 3 goals of the Christmas market. And I would say probably now for the last year and a half that I was really feeling the burden of this project, because when it started, it was quite small, and just to organize those workshops or get the ideas, it really wasn't that difficult. And yet the project in these 5 years has just grown and developed, and it got to the point where I thought, I can't do this. And it was last fall that I thought, if I get sick or if I have an accident, there is nobody else that knows all the details of this project. And I thought, this is not right. And so I presented my thoughts and of where I was at with this project. And last fall, it was probably a couple months before the Christmas market, and we obviously continued. But we just realized that we needed to reevaluate. First of all, were those 3 goals being met or not? And if they were, and we felt we needed to continue, what needed to change so that, first of all, so that I was comfortable with that. But also, at one point I said, do you as a church, do you see this as Kathy's project, or do you see this as a church project? And so we needed to think about that. What is the base of this project? Where are we going with it? And it was really interesting. First of all, there were a lot of people that jumped on board in that month and a half before the Christmas market, which was obviously a blessing. But it was interesting. And in essence, those people jumping on board, that was that first goal, the church working together. The second goal, we saw so many people come to this market, faces we'd never seen, and we thought, my goodness, where are all these people coming from? That was the second goal. The third goal, the profit, the financial profit, we had never seen as much raised through that project as we had. And so then it was, okay, what are we going to do? And in January, the group of people who were the most involved met, and in typical church fashion, we ate together, and then we discussed. Anyways, right away there was a couple. They retired, not for very long, and they jumped right in and said, Kathy, we'd love to be part of a committee. And then a few weeks later, I was talking with another woman and just said, does it interest you? And she said, Kathy, I'd love to. She was a little bit hesitant to come forward, and yet what a blessing it is to meet and for that brainstorming to be the four of us together, and then to see them really jumping on board and helping to shoulder the responsibility of this, and to help get the workshops together. We'll see where the project goes. We know we're on for this year. We'll see where the Lord directs us. But I think something, and I think Steve is going to get into this later, it's the idea of that whole idea of committees. I think it's too easy for one person to get an idea, and well, it's easy. It's easy to begin with, but then I guess it gets hard. But the idea of really working together, of a committee of people. And I think the other thing we're conscious of, that if a project like the Christmas project or whatever project is going to continue, young blood needs to get involved in those. The young people need to get involved in those things for there to be continuity in that. Okay. Yeah. I'll continue with our girls, just to give you a little update. I'll start with the older two, Anna and Sarah, if for those of you who remember, are twins. And I'll just go back a step. The year that we spent here, we didn't know, that was the school year of 2011, 2012. And we didn't know in leaving France to come here where our kids were going to be. Where were they going to settle? They were still doing studies, still traveling around. And so we thought, well, there's no use in trying to follow our kids, and that probably wouldn't have been a good thing anyways. Anyway, so we felt the Lord was leading us where we now live. And what is just really a blessing is that our two older, Anna and Sarah, live about 2.5 hours north of us, and Emily lives between an hour and a quarter, an hour and a half south of us. And I think what a blessing of the Lord, just for him to have put that together. Anyways, back to the two older ones, they live in the town of Grenoble, and Anna is a potter. She studied art history, finished her studies and came home. I don't really want to study art, I'd rather do art. So she went and did a 3-year apprenticeship. She's now a ceramicist. She teaches part-time in an art school and has her own pottery workshop, which has its ups and downs as she's getting set up. She continues and she absolutely loves it. Sarah, we often refer to her as our eternal student. She has about 1 more year to do on her doctorate degree. At the same time, she's teaching English and English literature as a foreign language in university level. Her goal is to teach, to be a lecturer at university. Emily, I don't know if you've read, I can see that up here. Yeah, I don't know if you've read about Emily here. Easter weekend. First, Emily works as a program director in an inner city community center in the city of Marseille, which I think is the second largest city in France. It's right down on the Mediterranean. Working with underprivileged children, about age probably 9 to 18. She loves to work. It's a challenge. I'm sure she would appreciate your prayers greatly. She was away for the Easter weekend, the Saturday, Sunday, and Monday with some of these kids on a sports weekend. And it was Monday about 11 o'clock or so, she had a phone call from her landlady to say that her apartment had blown up. And apparently there was, in her side of the apartment, she's on the second floor, and there was a man who had a propane, what do you say, a gas bottle, okay. And he was a smoker, and it was leaking, and he lit the cigarette, and it exploded. Well, we are just so thankful she wasn't there. She doesn't have the memories of that explosion. She doesn't have the choice of opening her door, and do I run through the flames or do I jump off the balcony? She doesn't have any of that. But today, as she would say, she's homeless. Now, somebody in her church has a holiday rental, and they had nobody in the month of May. So Emily is staying there, so she's not actually on the street. And it was so hard for me because we got this phone call on Monday at noon, and Steve and I left on Tuesday morning to start our travels to come here. And as you often do, you say, why, Lord? Why do things fit together like they do? And yet Emily is our daughter that in certain situations, if she doesn't want to deal with it, she shuts herself up. And she doesn't appear to be doing that. I mean, we can Skype with her, we talk with her often, and she doesn't appear to be doing that. And I think I would almost bet that if I was there, she probably would. Because she knows she can get her mom's sympathy, which is a good thing, but it's not always a healthy thing. And I'm just praising the Lord that she's staying strong, and that Emily doesn't always like to pray out loud, and yet with me on the phone, on Skype, she will pray with me, and we'll pray together. And as hard as it is to be away, and I'm sure those of you who are parents, you know what it's like to be away when your children are going through something difficult. And yet I think we can just really praise the Lord that he's keeping her strong. And I just sincerely believe that she's going to take another step in her relationship with the Lord in trusting him and putting her confidence in him in a time that is really difficult for her. So I know that she would appreciate your prayers. When I said that we were coming here today, she said, oh, I just love to go. So, just pray for her. Thanks.
I think at the moment, in terms of what's happening in the church, we're in a time of transition. The church has been going for 15, 20 years now, well, 17 years, I guess. And some of the people who were involved in leadership at the beginning are starting to get to the point where they're wanting to pass pass the responsibility onto other people. And so, it's always a time of turbulence when you have change like that. But up until now, things have been going pretty good. We've had one or two of the leaders step down. We've had a couple of younger guys who've stepped up, and it's neat. And that's one of the things that I think I would really ask you to pray for as far as the church is concerned. For this time of transition, and for younger people to start taking on more responsibility. It's something that I think everybody wants. But there's always that question of adaptation. How are they going to handle things? Can I trust them? But in any case, at the moment, that's the way things are moving forward. And the other question is the whole question of vision. What are we as a church trying to achieve? What's our objective? I think the church when it began in 2002, they hadn't really sat down and worked out what is our vision of what church is to be. But in many ways, I think what they were aiming for, they've achieved. I think they were looking to become a congregation that was big enough to have a church program that can attract families and can respond to families, and that it would be a church that would be diverse in terms of its ages, in terms of its background, and all those things are true. We have people coming from all over the place around the world. I think as well their vision was to have a building, and like I said, in 2012 they were able to purchase a building, and I guess their other element of it was to have have a pastor. Obviously, at the moment, they have a missionary pastor. At some point, the church has got to work towards being able to support its own pastor. But in many ways, you would say, well, what they were aiming for, they've achieved. But I don't want the church, and we don't want the church, and as a leadership, we don't want the church just to sort of become content and sit back and say, well, we've achieved what we were aiming for. I'm convinced that God wants us to continue moving forward. I've showing you there a photo of a city or a town about half an hour away from us. And we would really love to see a new congregation being planted in that town. It's the town of Digne-les-Bains, and there's 4 or 5 church families that live in the town. And one of my frustrations is that as a group of leaders, we're all committed to the idea. The people living there seem to be a lot less committed to it and less enthusiastic. And so I guess, I just pray that God would show us, to keep us in step with what he's wanting to do. Recently we went through the book by Rick Warren, 40 Days of Purpose. And the whole question of purpose, what are our goals, what are our objectives, clearly came through. And there was he was talking in one of the chapters about this verse in Acts 13. Now, when David had served God's purpose in his own generation, he fell asleep. And that whole notion of serving God in our generation, of putting God first, of drawing people into, encouraging people to come to know him and to grow in him. And the different aspects that Rick Warren brings out, the whole notion of living for the glory of God, of developing a loving church family relationships with one another, of becoming more Christ-like, of growing and becoming more and more conform to, resembling more and more Jesus Christ. Serving God with our gifts and sharing the gospel with those around us. And I think as church leaders, we see that as really being what we would like to see. But it's the working out of that that we'd ask that you would pray and just help us as we encourage us as we are trying to see that take place. I guess becoming more like a disciple and making disciples, that whole notion of being disciples and making disciples of those around us. That disciple lifestyle of loving God, of loving our brothers and sisters, of growing in our understanding and knowledge of who Christ is and becoming more like him, of serving God with the gifts that he's given us, and of sharing the gospel with those around us. That's, I think, what a disciple's life is all about. And, we really want to be a church of disciples that are making disciples and creating new communities of disciples. Our area needs so desperately to see new churches that are really enthusiastic and committed to that. And one of the joys for Kathy and I has been to see this young couple, Cedric and Therese, and their 2 young boys, go off to a Bible institute near Geneva. And they've just completed their first year of study at the institute. And their desire is to serve God. They want to serve God in their generation. And we want to encourage them in that. And there are other people as well in the church, younger people who are starting to grow in that desire to serve God in their generation. And that's really our prayer. They're going to be moving to a town called Gap, which is about an hour north of us. And they're going to do a 2-year internship in that church. But it's neat to see young people and young couples who are starting to pick up that desire to serve God in their generation. And each one of us should be enthusiastic and driven to serve God in our generation and in the younger generation as well, to see more people coming to Christ. And I guess as Kathy and I look back on what we've been involved in, we've been in France for nearly 28 years now, and time flies. I can remember the first times that we came here, but you guys have always been part of our team of encouragers, supporters, people who've been praying for us. And I just really want to say a big thank you to the church here for all that you've meant and for all that you've done, and the way that you've encouraged us, the way that you've been there with us when we've gone through tough times, and rejoiced with us when we've gone through good times. And that means so much to Kathy and I, to know that the church here is part of our support team, part of our family. And so, really, I just want to end by saying thank you. Thank you for who you are and for what you mean to us and for all that you've done for us. So God bless you all. Thank you.